Welcome, everyone. My name is Dave Arnold. I'm the Executive Director of the NextGen Precision Health Initiative, and I'm very excited about today's talk. We're here in Rolla, so we are live in Rolla, Missouri at the University of Missouri Science and Technology. We're also joined live streaming in the Roy Blunt NextGen Precision Health Building, as well as we have audience on Zoom. So before I introduce today's speaker, I want to make a couple announcements. So first of all, please join us for next month's NextGen Precision Health Discovery Series. So we're going to be learning about pioneering cardiovascular gene therapy. There is a link here to go ahead and register. I will circle back to this at the end of the lecture today. If you want to go ahead and register while we're here, please do that. And then next, what I want to really mention is one of the most important parts of the Discovery Series. So this is an effort to bring the most cutting-edge science to people that are scientists, to people that are non-scientists, really to reach out to the community. So we encourage our speakers to really give a 10,000-foot view of their science and what they're doing, and I'm very excited about today's topic. And so all of us are going to probably have additional questions. So the way that we want to make question asking equitable is we use a tool called Mentimeter. So this is a link if you want to take a picture of it. You can ask your questions online, and then basically those lists of questions will be compiled into a list that can be upvoted. So if you have a question on there that you like, you don't have to pose it again, just upvote that question that you like. So please go ahead and take a picture of that link here. So today I'm very honored to introduce Dr. Mark Towler. Dr. Towler was a speaker at our Pathways Symposium last spring, and I'm going to mention that after the talk today and hopefully encourage a lot of people to join us, the symposium will be in Kansas City. So Dr. Towler is the Linda and Bipin Doshi Professor of Chemical and Biochemical Engineering here at Missouri University of Science and Technology. Dr. Towler is very prolific. He has published over 180 peer-reviewed papers and garnered over $28 million of funding for his work. His work centers around biomaterials and medical devices that have been developed into diagnostic strategies and ways to assess things such as bone health. But today we're going to hear about his journey developing a technology that reduces the impact of bleeding, so to improve hemostasis. And so without further ado, I would love to introduce and welcome Dr. Towler.
Okay. All right, so I'm going to spend the first few minutes of my talk talking about me, my favorite subject, and then I'm going to talk about some of my science, not just this particular area, but some of my other innovations that are commercially being used now. So my academic CV, I have been around various different places. I'll talk about those places in a moment. Most of my work is in the medical devices space, not just devices themselves, but diagnostics as well. I've garnered about $28 million of research funds from private equity, industry, and granting sources. And that has allowed me to file and have granted 8 patents in the medical devices space, which has led to 2 companies being spun off and 2 additional licenses. So I'm going to talk about those technologies as we start the talk. My career, as you can tell from my accent, I'm not from around here. I'm from the most landlocked city in the UK, which is right in the middle over there, a place called Derby, which is also the centre of the Industrial Revolution. So the first water wheels and water mills, the first cotton spinning all occurred just down the road from where I am. I did my degrees in polymer science in Manchester. Anybody a Manchester United fan? One. Oh well, there's always one. My master's degree in materials in Liverpool, and I studied for a Ph.D. in biomedicine in medical devices in the University of London. My Ph.D. was looking at reinforcing artificial bone, making it harder and making it tougher. And that was funded by a company with a commercial expectation at the end of that PhD. So that really got me into the importance of translating my research. After my PhD, I spent a couple of years working for a company called Shofu, who are a Japanese medical devices and dental devices company. And I was with them for a couple of years. They had one little branch outside of Japan, and that was in the UK. Right to the bottom of the UK, kind of this area in the Garden of England, it's called, Kent. And my work was really looking at making glass-based devices for dentistry predominantly, and for ear, nose, and throat applications. So one of the things I invented while I was there was a little cement that could hold the inner bones of the ear together, the hammer, anvil, and stirrup, if you remember those kind of things from schoolboy biology. The hammer, anvil, and stirrup in everybody is not developed properly as you age. But what was found several years ago, that you don't need them to be developed properly to work. You just need them to be contacting each other. So when I was in Shofu, I developed a little cement that would allow sound to transfer between those three little bones by sticking them together basically with a bioadhesive to restore hearing to people. After 2 years of working in industry, I realized I wasn't very good at being told what to do. So I went over to academia and moved to the west coast of Ireland to the University of Limerick. So Limerick at the time was a relatively small city with a relatively new university. It had turned from a technical college about 10 years before I got there. And when I was there, I hit Ireland just at the right time. There was a huge amount of medical device industry forming on the west coast of Ireland. It was mainly US companies who were looking for a base in Europe. The argument was that the US companies, Medtronic, Zimmer, Stryker, How Medica, they all wanted easy access to Europe. What they really wanted was a very low corporate tax rate, which is what Ireland gave them then and still gives them now, which is 12%, I think 5% lower than anywhere else in Europe. But it was a good time to be there because my research interests aligned with the industry and the funding environment at the time. So I spun off my first biomed company in, I think it was 2006, which was a company called Crescent Diagnostics, which I'm going to talk about in a moment in a bit more detail. Crescent developed well, I guess what I did was I discovered a link between fingernails and bones, which led to a diagnostic for fracture risk, and I'll talk about that in a moment. So that was the first spin-off company from the University of Limerick. I think it was actually possibly the first spin-off company from Ireland. The second spin-off company came along 2 years later, and they had a lab on a chip technology, and that technology sold for $600 million in about 2009. I'm still waiting for my payday, but I'm not jealous at all. After 10 years in Ireland, I moved to Alfred University, the middle one there, which is a small semi-private university in upstate New York. Alfred really specialized in glass and ceramics, both on the engineering side and on the art side. So it has the second biggest glass arts department in the continental US. I was an endowed chair there thanks to some money from a Japanese ceramics company that funded 4 endowed chair positions. After 3 years in Alfred, I decided I didn't like the snow, didn't like the cold, so I moved to Canada. And I was in Ryerson University, which is now called Toronto Metropolitan University, for 10 years, where I was cross-appointed between the university and the local hospital, St Mike's Hospital, which is a teaching hospital in downtown Toronto. And that was a great position. It gave me the chance to come up with wacky ideas in the biomedical space, and I could walk down a flight of stairs and knock on the door of a rheumatologist, an orthopedic surgeon, a cancer specialist, and find out if my idea was just wacky or had some potential. So I was there for 10 years, and 18 months ago, I moved down to Missouri, and I've been here since then. So it's been a bit of a checkered career, moving around quite a lot, and hopefully this move will be for a little longer than the previous ones. In terms of talking about me for a moment, in terms of my family, I'm married to my wife Towler, who I met in Ireland, so we're doing our bit for the peace process. She's Irish, I'm English. We have 2 kids, and this is from the day we arrived in the US to take up the new job. In terms of other interests, I'm a big fan of James Bond. Anybody who can see that picture closely can see that my kids, from the looks on their faces, share my interest as well. This is at a James Bond convention or museum, in Berlin a few years ago. I'm a big fan, particularly of books, and I'm such a fan that I actually bought the cheapest Aston Martin in the continental US a few years ago, which is still, as far as I can see, still running relatively well. Now, I don't want to dispel any rumours, but there's been a lot of talk about who the next James Bond will be, and I can do no more than just share this poster. Some people might see that I was meeting Daniel Craig on a film set. Some might see a passing of the torch. I'll leave you to make up your own conclusions. What I will say, though, is for anybody with really good eyesight, you can see at the back someone who closely resembles me, my stunt double. But it's not my position to announce anything big here. I'll move on and let the film company do that at a later date. Okay, so very quickly then, I'll talk about two of my previous spin-off companies. And 1 second, I have my water. And I'll explain how they really got me an interest into the orthopedic commercialization field. So I mentioned briefly about my company Crescent, which developed a fracture risk for osteoporosis. Sorry, a diagnostic for osteoporosis. The way this test works is that osteoporosis is a very damaging disease. It affects both parts that make up bone, both the mineral phase of bone and the proteins. The proteins in bone are predominantly collagen. The proteins in fingernail are predominantly keratin. And while keratin and collagen are different proteins, they have a lot in common. Collagen is formed by the amino acid polycondensation, so is keratin. Collagen requires sulfation to form properly, so does keratin. And they're both present in the basal layer of the skin. So it's reasonable to assume that if a disease is as damaging as osteoporosis affects collagen so dramatically, it will also affect related structural proteins in a measurable way. And that idea came to me about 15, 20 years ago when I was sitting down for a beer with an orthopedic surgeon. And he said that most of his patients who develop osteoporosis, their fingernails go floppy. And when they start taking medication to treat that, bisphosphonates or strontium ranulates, their fingernails stiffen up again. So it's reasonable to assume that fingernails are a window into bone health. So I started looking at different ways of measuring stiffness of proteins in fingernails and using that as an indication of proteins in bone. What I found through various different clinical trials and various different patent applications, and you can see the 4 granted patents that the company is based around, we found that we could not only use fingernails to diagnose fracture risk, but we could predict it up to 10 years out. So the way this test works is that you can go into a chemist in the UK and hopefully very soon a pharmacy in the US and buy a box off the shelf, and the test is called Ascentia. You buy that box, and in that box is 2 things, a questionnaire and a paper bag. A plastic bag. In the plastic bag, you take a fingernail clipping, put it into the bag, and you fill the questionnaire in. Now, the questionnaire is full of what are called clinical risk factors. So we ask you your age, your BMI, whether you smoke or drink, and if so, how much. Have your parents fractured? Have you ever fractured? Did you ever take corticosteroids, asthma inhalers, which can dramatically affect your risk of developing osteoporosis? And by adding the data from that clinical risk factor questionnaire to the Raman spectroscopy analysis of the proteins in your fingernail sample, through our patented black box, effectively, we can predict your relative risk of fracture. Now, we tested this. When I first invented this tech, I spun it into a company. And at the time, as I said, Ireland was a very open society for investment into biotech. This was sort of 2005, 2006. So within about a month of touring around VC and private equity sources, we had $1 million to get this idea tested. We ran various different clinical trials, first in the UK and then in the US, to not only see if we could screen for fracture, but then to diagnose for fracture. And from those studies, we found that we could diagnose up to 8 years out. We now know from our recent clinical trials, again patented, that we can also evaluate the quality of response to treatment. So if you are diagnosed as having a fracture or you've had a fracture, and you go on to bisphosphonates, by analysing the fingernail tissue, we can measure how well your proteins are responding to that treatment. What that effectively means, that's theranostics. What that effectively means is we can diagnose your response to therapy. So going forward, we should hopefully be able to tailor your treatment or the suggested treatment for you to overcome your bone health issues. Very recently, only about a month ago, we signed a deal with a company called Randox, who are a European diagnostics company. They're the equivalent, I guess, of Quest over here. And they now sell our tool online, both through their conventional hospital system and through their wellness clinics, but also online. £79. If anybody wants one of these, come to me, I'll get you a discount. So Randox, I should point out, were a relatively small company until COVID, and they did all the COVID testing in airports and so on in Europe. And they now sponsor the Grand National, which is the UK version of the Kentucky Derby. and they sponsored Team GB at the Olympics, the Great British Olympics team. So they are a very well-respected, very well-invested company, and we're very happy to partner with them. The second technology I'm going to talk about very quickly before I get to my technology that I'm here for is a new material called bone glue. Now, I said at the start of this talk that my first job was working for Shofu, and we invented little adhesives that could go into the bones or the ears, to the bones of the ears or dental applications to stick things together. Now, anybody who's ever had orthodontic work done, and my kid's going through brackets and braces at the moment, what they do in the last 30 or 40 years is they use a little adhesive to stick those brackets to the teeth. Yeah, it's a little white, clear adhesive. It's called a glass ionomer cement. They were invented, like many of the best things, in the UK in the 1970s, and they've been used in orthodontics to stick brackets and braces to teeth, in endodontics for sealing root canals, and in restorative dentistry as an alternative to composites for filling teeth since the 70s. Those materials are really clever materials. They set a body temperature, they're sticky, they're strong, they are radiopaque, which means they show up on x-rays. They can be tailored to release certain ions, certain elements, to have a beneficial process. So for example, in dentistry, these glass ionomer cements in orthodontics release fluoride. That's why you don't have to worry too much about cleaning your teeth when you're having orthodontic work. There's fluoride released there at source. So all those properties make these materials ideal for other non-dental applications, like orthopedics, sticking together broken bones, sticking in hip implants and so on. But all the commercial versions of these, and they've been around for 60 years now, all the commercial versions of these contain aluminium. And the only way to, and aluminium is not a toxin as we normally see it, that when you swallow any aluminium off these dental fillings, you don't absorb it in the gut, you pee it out, so it doesn't cause any problems. But aluminium is a neurotoxin. If you have it in contact with blood or tissue, you can get seriously weird things happening, seizures, fits, all manner of things you don't want happening in an orthopedic situation. So the holy grail has always been to make these materials that work like they do in dentistry. They're sticky, they're strong, you can see them on x-rays, but don't contain aluminium. And through various fiddling around with the periodic table over the last 20 years, I've come up with two ways of making this material that are aluminium-free. One is based on strontium, and one is based on zinc. The zinc is clever because it's an antibacterial agent. So here, if you remove the aluminium, the neurotoxin, and put zinc in them, you get a material that not only sticks the bones together, but can also fight off bacterial infection. And strontium is a clever ion as well, because strontium is a common treatment for osteoporosis. So if you get a fracture, they often give you strontium ranolate drugs. That strontium helps build bone. So our cement will help build bone when it's put at a weak point in the skeleton, at a fracture. This technology was first fiddled around by me in the early 2000s. We invented new iterations of it just before I left Toronto. Those patents granted in 2002. And if you can see on the picture, it's not that clear in here, but we see a human cadaveric arm at the top. We see on the first picture a break being made by an osteotome. You're breaking the bone, and then you're sticking cement into that bone, and you can see it's darker. I have a pointer here, but it's darker than the bone on the second picture in the middle, and that's our cement. So it holds the bone together, it shows up on x-rays, and by the release of strontium or zinc, it can either fight off infection or build bone formation at the implant site. Now, if I was technologically adept enough to put a video into my presentation, you'll see that third picture. We can move the cadaveric arm, and that cement will flex with the arm without breaking. So that technology, we've literally just incorporated a company around it. We've got some investment at the moment. We're looking for more. The company's based in the UK. Probably the cleverest thing, though, is the third patent here. It's nothing to do with the cement, but it's to do with an adhesive, a delivery kit to inject the cement. Like with anything you buy nowadays, there is a consumable aspect to it. You buy an iPad, you need to get the songs separately. You buy a car, you need to get new tyres eventually. You need a consumable aspect to have a business. So here, we have a delivery kit where you put the components of the cement into it, you can store it on the shelf until you need it, you remove it from the shelf, you sterilise it, you push the plunger in, that mixes the cement components together, and then this end of the device, you pull off the little screw cap, and you screw it back onto a cannula so you can inject the cement directly into the fracture site. So that's a material that we've been working on the last few years. We also have a patent on that technology, and that hopefully will start to progress forward very quickly. Now we have some funding in place for it. So now for the last half an hour or so of my talk, I'll talk about the material I'm here to talk about, which is this material to treat bleed out in traumatic and military applications. So I always think that before you start talking about developing new materials, you need to make sure that everybody understands what the problem is you're trying to address. And the problem here is hemorrhage. Hemorrhage is defined as the discharge of blood from a ruptured blood vessel. In fact, more than 1 of every 3 of blunt trauma hemorrhagic deaths, those kind of deaths we get in military applications, even in the home setting, people falling over, people landing on things, more than 1 in 3 of those are deemed preventable. Globally, hemorrhage is the leading cause of mortality during childbirth, during surgery, and also in war. And in war, it's the mechanism of over 80% of potentially survivable cases. So I guess the question is, if 1 in 3 blunt trauma hemorrhagic deaths are preventable, and 80% of war deaths are preventable or survivable, why aren't they? Why are so many people dying in situations that they should otherwise survive? And the reason is that the current materials in that space aren't very good. I'll explain why now. So, the current commercial materials, and every big medical device company has one of these hemostat materials to stop bleeding. None of them work very well. Let's go very quickly through why they don't work as well as they should do. All hemostats can be broken down really into 2 groups. They can either be organic or inorganic materials. Let's go with the inorganic materials first. The inorganic materials are usually clay-based materials. Okay? Now, has anybody ever made like a plot or a plate on a wheel, on a spinning wheel? Yeah. So the way in which you get to move that clay around is you put water on it, yeah? So that's how clay works. Clay is very, very well bonded layers of ceramic with loosely bonding between those layers, van der Waals bonding between those layers, which can be broken very easily by the presence of water. So in the same way that you can make a plate on a potter's wheel by putting water there and moving those layers of clay around, by breaking those van der Waals bonds and applying water in between them, the inorganic hemostats work the same way. You take a packet of clay, you put it onto a wound, the blood flows in between those clay particles and forms a clot. Okay? Now, those materials have been around for 40 years now, I guess. Every US soldier, and I think every Canadian soldier, carries a pack of clay in their backpack, and that clay is called quick clot. You see it at the top there? And quick clot is effectively, I think it used to be a zeolite, now I think it's actually a lignite clay. But regardless of what they make it out of now, that material, when you apply it to the wound, gets hot. So you get heat generated. So that helps in forming the clot. The blood flows into those layers between the clay and forms a clot. But that heat generated can cause third-degree tissue burns. More than that, the material doesn't dissolve, stays there for good. So in order to remove it from the wound, you have to go in there with a scalpel and scrape it away. And what you often do is you scrape away some of the healthy tissue, and if not that, you scrape away some of the clot as well. So you cause rebleeding. So whilst you may stop the patient from, or the soldier from dying, you're almost certainly going to result in third-degree burns, possibly leading to amputation, and almost certainly leading to a lot of medical care post the injury because you have to stop the rebleeding when you remove the clay. The alternative to that material is an organic material, and one example is here, Surgicel. And Surgicel is effectively a cellulose, it's a plant. And what we do is we formulate that plant and we extrude that plant and we purify that plant to make these thin layers of cellulosic sheets. And this stuff can be used in surgery. So if you have an unexpected bleed in, say, an orthopedic surgery, say the surgeon nicks an artery, layers of this material can be applied and they effectively act as a barrier to stop the bleed. The major problem with this material is it's very expensive. It's about $7,000 a pack. So the quick clot material, the nasty, dirty material that works quite well, that's carried around by every soldier, is about $20 a pack. This is about $7,000. The organic materials, as well as being expensive, have additional problems that they can cause irritation in the surrounding area by the plant material reacting with the blood. And they're also difficult to remove as well. They have to be removed, again, causing rebleeding. So both of the commercial conventional materials, the cheap and nasty quick clot based on clay or the very expensive cellulosic Surgicel, have inherent problems. And that's why a third group of materials are on the market now. And one of the examples of those materials is the top material, Arista. Now, Arista, and my wife, who's Irish, thinks this is hilarious. It's made out of spuds, made out of potatoes. That's all it is. It's refined starch taken out of potatoes. It's effectively made in the same way, out of the same things as Pringles and Lay's. They both extract the starch and compact the potato-based material. This material actually isn't a bad hemostat. It's cheaper than the Surgicel. It's not quite as effective as a quick clot, but it's not as dirty and not as exothermic. But it's also very, very light. It's made out of potatoes, it's made out of starch. You try and apply it to a bleeding wound, and it gets pushed out the way by the bleed. Okay, so it's not very effective because it doesn't stay where you put it. So effectively, all those three materials are all lacking in some fundamental way, explaining why we have so many people bleeding of wounds that are potentially survivable. So when I was trying to put this talk together, I was looking for an idea of what we really wanted from the ideal hemostat. And this is a paper of I think it was a paper from the 1980s that I found, which talks about what an ideal hemostat should be. So this is what we were trying to achieve with my new approach. Firstly, we want a material that achieves hemostasis in less than 2 minutes. A lot of very aggressive bleeds can cause bleed out in the space of 10, 20 minutes, even less if it's an arterial bleed in the neck. So you want something that can stop that bleeding before that person dies, otherwise it has a limited use. Ideally, you want a material that can be used in every application, so you only have to have one product. So you want something that can be used for topical, surface wounds, as much as it can be used for deep, aggressive bleeds. It needs to be either easily removable from the wound, so we don't have the problem that we have with the quick clot material, where you have to remove it and cause rebleeding. And one of the best ways of having something that's easily removable is something that degrades at the site. Okay? So something that's either easily removable or biodegradable. Ideally, you want something that isn't like quick clot. You don't want something that causes burns. You want something that isn't like Surgicel. You don't want something that causes inflammatory reactions. And the last thing you want is something that causes thrombosis, blood clots somewhere else in the body. You don't want to stop someone bleeding here by causing a clot and finding that product causes a clot somewhere else. One of the big examples of that being a problem is there was a material by a company called, what they're called now, Novo Nordisk. Has anybody heard of Novo Nordisk? A lot of you may be using their products at the moment. They make Ozempic. One of Ozempic's previous products was a material that was designed to cause a clot where a bleed was, okay? And it was an alternative to quick clot, and the US military took this very seriously until they found they were actually killing a lot of the soldiers in the clinical trials. Because that material was not only causing a thrombosis at the bleeding site in the air, it's causing thromboses in the brain and the heart as well. So if anybody is using Ozempic, I apologize, but that company doesn't have a particularly great track record. So you want something that doesn't have any of those side effects. It's also ideal to have something that is usable in low temperature and wind and rain. Now, in a clinic, if somebody has an arterial nick and you have a sheet of Surgicel, that's a very clean environment. But most bleeds don't occur in a clean environment. There's nothing clean about a road traffic accident in the rain. There's nothing clean about a wound in the military environment. So you want something that can be used when it's dry, when it's cold, when it's wet, when it's hot, and something that is stable in all those conditions as well. You also want something that is safe and easy to administer. Any material that will only work if you have a trained orthopedic surgeon there is not going to be much use if your family member cuts themselves on a knife in the kitchen, or if somebody has an accident on the road, or if somebody's shot late at night in downtown St. Louis. You want something that's safe and easy to administer. And the best hemostat is one you never have to use, one that can sit on the shelf for 20 years and you don't have to think about it. So it has to be inexpensive enough to be stored for a long period of time and has a long shelf life. No one wants to use these things, so the longer they can store there without being used, the better. None of those previous materials, the organics, the inorganics, the potato-based ones, address those issues. We hope that this material will. And what we've invented is what's called a mesoporous bioactive glass with nanometer-sized pores. That sounds very complicated. What it really is a glass the same as, if these windows are made of glass, I don't know if they're made of perspex or plexiglass, but let's say they're made of glass. It's effectively a similar material to that, those windows, but manufactured in such a way that it has lots of little holes and pores in it, okay? We also make that material in a specific environment or in a specific chemistry that means when you put it into blood, it will dissolve. So that's the two things that make it different to the glass in the windows, the glass we wear as spectacles. It's made so it has pores in it, and it's made to dissolve slowly in blood to some degree. We're having some discussions with one of my students at the moment as to how much these things actually do dissolve. But they dissolve to some degree to allow a certain process to occur, and I'll explain what that is now. So this is a glass. You can make it very easily, very cheaply. It's not as simple as making these glasses because we have to have these pores maintained in them. So we have to use a process called sol gel chemistry rather than melt quench or plate glass chemistry, which is what we use for most glasses. But effectively, it's a conventional glass. The way it works as a hemostat is we take a powder of that glass, a handful of it, feels like sand. If you have a bleed, you place it into that wound, and in the same way that the liquid components of blood flow between the layers of the quick clot material, the same happens here. The liquid components of blood flow into those little pores through capillary action, and that means what you have left on the surface of the glass are all the clotting factors, okay? So that approach, that physical approach where the blood separates, goes into the capillaries, and the remaining clotting factors of the blood stay on the surface, affects a physical clot very quickly. We're not the first people to do that. People have made these meso glasses before, but no one has ever made them containing tantalum. And that's what the clever thing is here. That's the patentable thing. That when the liquid components of blood flow into the pores, that starts to degrade slowly the glass, and that releases whatever the glass is made of. Glasses are, whether they're glasses now or they're glasses that are used in medieval church windows in the 1600s in the UK, they all contain effectively the same thing: sodium, calcium, and silica. The only thing that's different really with our material is we contain a small amount of tantalum. And the reason we do that is that tantalum has been proven in the literature to accelerate the clotting cascade. So anyone that knows anything about blood clotting, basically think of it as a series of dominoes. And one domino gets knocked over, hits the next one, and so on. What tantalum does is it makes some of those dominoes, clotting factor 8 I think it is, bigger and more prone to fall over. Okay? So when it falls over, it accelerates that clotting regime faster. So we have a material that is both physically and chemically clotting. I don't want to go too much into the chemistry because no one's really that interested about that, me included. But basically what these materials are is a conventional glass, silica, calcium. We have a bit of phosphate in ours. And what we've done is include and increase the amount of tantalum in the glass. So the more tantalum that releases, the faster these things start to cause a clot. So the question is, why tantalum? Well, the reason what we thought of tantalum is we know it speeds up the clotting cascade. It makes that domino bigger and easier to knock over. But what I've learned from my 20 years in the commercial, translational medical device space is you need something that is novel in order to get a patent. So it needs to be novel and effective. Tantalum ions have never been patented in any medical device to my knowledge. Tantalum, the metal, however, is. If anybody's ever had a hip implant or a knee implant, they probably haven't come across these materials. But if you've had a revision knee implant or a revision hip implant, a second one to replace the failed first one, you probably have one of these little devices in your knee or your hip. And it's called an augment. And basically what it is, it's like a plant pot. You put the hip implant into that, and that goes into the leg. Because on a second surgery, a second hip implant, the implant has to be bigger to replace the one that's taken out, and the bone remaining is less because you have to drill around the first implant. So this acts as effectively a spacer between the implant and the bone. And tantalum is used because it has high surface energy, is very bioactive, very biocompatible, and so there are a whole series of products based purely on tantalum metal, made by a company called Zimmer, one of the big 5 biomech companies. So they really kind of pushed the barriers forward for the use of tantalum as a metal in medical devices. We were the first ones to use tantalum as an ionic form. Okay? But the great thing about Zimmer doing this is that there is some track record of the use of tantalum in the medical devices and therefore the FDA space. So we're novel in that we're the first to use tantalum ions, but we have a path to follow regulatory-wise because Zimmer already used the same material in its metallic form in orthopedics. Okay, so let's talk about where we are with the technology. Well, I came up with the idea in about 2015. I applied for a grant from the Canadian version of the NIH called CIHR in 2016, which we got, and we really had no idea about these materials at the time, but an idea about whether they could potentially be chemical and physical hemostats. So we made a few different glass compositions, and we tried them in the lab to see if they could stop clot, or if they could cause clotting in blood. As soon as you take blood out of any animal, it starts to clot. So the data in the lab is very prone to interpretation, I think is the best way of putting it. The only real way of evaluating how these materials work is to put them into living systems, animals. This work was done with a hematologist in St. Mike's Hospital in Toronto, a guy called Hayu Ni, who was an expert in this, and he kind of said, you know, you can spend 3 years of your grant working in the lab, or you can get these into animals to see what they do. So the way in which you test these materials are in a topical modality, so just a surface cut, and if it works in that model, then we look at it for more aggressive, more invasive bleeds. Okay? So the two models that we use for that are the murine tail cut, which I'll explain in a moment, and the porcine liver bleed. And these are relatively standard models. The liver bleed particularly is the FDA-approved gold standard for evaluating a hemostat material. All right, so the murine tail bleed is as unpleasant and as ridiculous as it sounds. We take a series of mice and we cut off the end of their tail. And we pick them up and we dab the end of their tail on blotting paper until they stop bleeding. So a mouse tail cut is effectively a topical bleed which is survivable. A mouse will eventually clot. Those dots on there are about 15 seconds apart, I think. So it takes 2 or 3 minutes for the mouse to clot, but they will clot naturally. The way to evaluate whether our material is able to accelerate the clot, to reduce the bleeding time, is to take a thin layer of the material you see here, put it onto the end of the tail, post the cut, and pick up the mouse again and go along and dab it until it stops bleeding. And what you'll see from that, on number 2 here, is that the bleeding stops at a much quicker rate. So the bleeding time is dramatically reduced by the presence of our hemostat. There's a lot of artistic interpretations of this, as you can imagine, but this is the conventional way in which we evaluate these materials. The way to make it less open to interpretation is to have a standard, a commercial hemostat comparing to our material. So in here, it's a study we published, I think, in about 2019. We took a handful of mice, I think 10 under each condition. We then took some of them and left them to clot naturally. We then applied a small layer of arista, that's the potatoes, the spuds, on the tail and measured the bleeding time. And then we used our material. And we looked at different increasing iterations of tantalum. What you can see from that, hopefully, and there's a lot of spread in these results because that always happens with mice, particularly with any animal model. Their biological environments, the biological systems, some of these mice are older than others, some of them bleed faster than others. You're going to get some variation. But what you're going to get, effectively, is a topical bleed stopping in about 9 minutes in a mouse without any intervention. If you then apply some of the spuds on the bottom of the tail, you'll find that that bleeding time reduces to maybe about 8 minutes. Now, that is a commercial product. Arista is owned by Bard. It's now actually owned by a company called BD. Bard bought it from the manufacturer, a company called Metaphor, for $380 million in about 2014. A lot of money goes into it. If you ever go to an orthopedic conference or any kind of medical conference, you'll see this stuff advertised everywhere at the conference. It's the gold standard hemostat material for any application. From our study here, it doesn't seem to work particularly well. It reduces the bleeding time a bit, but not dramatically. When you then look at the next column, which is our tantalum-free version of our Bioglass, we see our material is pretty much about as good as the market leader. But what's really interesting is that when you add tantalum to that material, and then you're using both the chemical and the physical clotting of the material, you see the bleeding time reduces dramatically to about 3 minutes. So it seems from that very rough and ready study that our material without tantalum, just relying on the blood flowing into the pores and causing a clot, is as good as Arista, pretty much. But you add tantalum, it's much better again. What we don't know from that is how much tantalum is enough tantalum. We just see that it has a reduction, but is there an optimum amount of tantalum to cause that bleeding to occur? Now, tantalum is very expensive. Okay, it's really expensive. If you want to make 100 grams of this material, I think you were saying this morning it was about $200 to make 10 grams with a small amount of tantalum, with the lowest tantalum loading. If you go to a higher tantalum loading, that price goes up to $800 or $900. So it's important to know how much tantalum is enough. Okay? The way in which we did that, the way in which we evaluate this material in a much more aggressive model is the class 4 hemorrhage or the porcine liver bleed model. Now, I'm sorry if anyone's squeamish, but this is the way we do that. We take a pig and we try and simulate a gunshot wound. And we cut away, you can see from the bottom image, it's quite good, it's very light in here, so you can't see too much detail. But you'll see that the liver has been, about a third of the liver has been removed. The liver is highly vascularized, it bleeds like crazy. You've all heard of the phrase bleeding like a stuck pig. That's where it comes from. And what we did there is try to see if our material or Arista could stop that clotting faster. Now, it may look like we cheated here a bit. It may look like we put more of our material on the wound than the Arista material. I can tell you that's purely down to the student who was photographing this was just wholly traumatized by the whole process. But I can guarantee that the amount of clotting agent was the same in both trials. What we saw then from that study is that when we looked at Arista, the bleeding time for that pig was just over 45 minutes. When we looked at applying a standard surgical gauze, so like a bandage onto that wound on another pig, we found the bleeding time is again 45 minutes. That doesn't mean that the gauze or the Arista stops bleeding in 45 minutes. That means the pig bled out in 45 minutes. Those two interventions were wholly ineffective. When we added our tantalum-free glass, or a small amount of tantalum, we reduced that bleeding down time to somewhere between 5 and 10 minutes. But when you then added more tantalum, remember that tantalum is the big domino, it helps knock that big domino over to cause the clot. We saw that the bleeding time reduced to less than 5 minutes. If a pig's allowed to bleed for 45 minutes, or even 10 minutes, it's pretty much game over for the pig. If we can stop the pig bleeding in less than 5, the pig has a survivable chance. Now, unfortunately, in these kind of trials, the pig has no chance at all because we have to euthanize them after the trial. But if a pig is resuscitated and stops bleeding within 5 minutes, they have a viable chance, as would a human, of surviving the bleed. Now, the question is why then? Why are these working so much better than Arista? Well, let's look very quickly at the top of picture B. We see there particles of the Arista. Those are the big kind of bright particles there. And we see the first instances of an early clotting reaction. We see those fibrin chains, and we see these RBCs, red blood cells. Yeah? What we also see is those red blood cells and those fibrin chains aren't interacting with the Arista particles. They're not growing on the surface. They're forming a clot, but they're forming it almost despite the Arista particles, not because of it. When you look at our material here, and this is probably the best two examples I could find, we see the same fibrin chains, we see the same red blood cells, but we see them spreading out and growing on the surface of our glass particles. So they're reacting with the material, and the material is actively facilitating the clotting to occur. Very quickly then, as I said, this is a non-survivable process for the pig, so we don't really know what happens a month down the line, a week down the line, even an hour down the line. We don't know if the glass that dissolves at the site reappears somewhere else. We don't know if the pig pees it out. We don't know what happens to it. And we can't due to the ethical style of the trial. What we can see is a little bit of liver histopathology, where we took samples of the liver from the Arista-treated pig and from our material, and we found that the amount of hemorrhage, amount of bleeding, was about the same for our material as for Arista. Slightly higher, but nothing to be concerned about. We also saw the tissue necrosis, the death of the tissue, was roughly the same regardless of the intervention, Arista or our MBG. Our stuff had a slightly higher necrosis extent, and that's because our material is actually stopping bleeding. It's actually working. The Arista isn't really doing a lot. It's just there, so it's not interfering or intervening in the bleeding process. Our thing is, and that's why it's causing a slightly more necrosis than it would do in the normal material, in the Arista situation. So very quickly then, going back to what we talked about if you remember slide 4 at the start, and we looked at all the things that an ideal hemostat should need, we find that our material ticks most of those boxes. Achieves hemostasis, even in that kind of aggressive bleed, not in 2 minutes, but within 5. It's antibacterial, due to the release of various different ions, including tantalum. It's radiopaque, which means it shows up on X-rays, so we can use it in examples where we can't see where the bleed is. One of the situations that the military are looking for is ways of treating non-compressible bleeds in the torso, where you can't see where the bullet's gone and where the bleed is. So if you can put this stuff in under X-rays, either in that situation, or even in dental applications where you have dental bleeds of the jaw post-cleaning, a real problem for older people who are often on blood thinners. If you can see where this material is going on an X-ray, even if you can't physically see where you're putting it, that's a massive sellable feature. It's suitable for both topical, in this case the mouse tail bleed, and deep, in this case the class 4 hemorrhage in the liver wounds. There are no side effects that we can see, and it's easy to use. This work was all done by a trauma surgeon in Toronto, St Mark's Hospital. But there are examples where in the mice, for example, where my Ph.D. students are doing the work, or other relatively junior clinical fellows were doing the work. Easy to use by most people. And because it's a glass, provided you don't get it wet, it's like a gremlin. If you get it wet, you have a problem. If you don't get it wet, it can stay on the shelf for as long as you need. Just very quickly, I want to talk about what we're doing next. We've got a few minutes left. We're looking at ways of improving handling. Surgeons often like to feel they're controlling the bleed, even if they're not. So it's not enough that they can sprinkle powder on. They want to be able to compress the wound with a material. So we're now looking at ways of spinning those powders made by this Sol-Gel process into fibers using electrospinning. So we can take those powders after they're made and then put them through electrospinning to make a gauze or a mesh or a net, even like a pad, out of these glass powders. Does the shape of those materials make a difference? Well, we have them in powder form, we have them in fiber form. We've tested them both in a pig trial, in a mouse trial. And what we found is that, considering the error bars on them, pretty much, whether they're in fiber form or powder form, they work as well as stopping the bleed. Okay? So you lose some of the mesoporosity by spinning them into fibers, but you also include then macroporosity. You're putting these bigger pores in between the glass fibers that also act as a way of improving hemostasis. So where are we commercially? This is supposed to be a NextGen talk, so we need to talk very quickly in the last 2 minutes about commerciality. I said I had this funded by a grant in November 16. I took the chance of filing a patent at the same time on the hope that the technology would work. The patent was filed in November 2016 and was granted in the US in 2022, I think May. So most patents effectively have 20 years from their first submission date. So we have until 2036 to commercialize this technology or to make money out of it. The Canadian patent is also pending. I was unfortunate that I couldn't get coverage for Europe because we have a limited amount of money in my university for patenting processes. What's the size of the market? Well, the global hemostat market, the total, I don't know if you're familiar with TAM and SAM, but TAM is basically total addressable market. How big is the hemostat market worldwide? It's about $5.5 billion. The service addressable market, the realistic amount of market one product can take, about a third of the market, is about $1.3 billion. All the big medical device companies, Medtronic, Abbott, Baxter, Stryker, all have hemostat products. They all take a big part of that market. They also have hemostat products that are very close to the end of their patents. So there's a real need for new materials to come in. Not only to replace these off-patent materials, but also because we have, as we hear on the news every day, an increasing military conflict. We have a great tsunami. We have an older geriatric population, many on blood thinners. We also, for some reason, we have an increase in postpartum hemorrhage rates in hospitals. There's lots of reasons that could be related to that, but regardless of what the real reason is, a 22% increase in the last time figures were recorded between 2003 and 2011 means a lot more people are bleeding out who need emergency treatment through a working hemostatic material. So a big potential market, and you can see that from the last 10 years, some of the sales have gone into place. Bard acquired Metaphor in 2013. Metaphor, if you remember, is that potato-based material, Arista. They bought it, it doesn't work very well. They bought it for, I think the figures actually added up to about $360 million for the purchase of Arista. Baxter, a very a big medical device company that is prolific in acquisition rather than research. They bought 2 different hemostatic products in 2018 and 2021. And probably the most interesting of those numbers is in Teleflex. Teleflex are a company, they're basically a private equity firm, but they acquired Z-Medica in 2020. And Z-Medica is the company that make that quick clot material that every US soldier carries. That apparently is a $220 million a year contract just for the US Army. And as the US Army says in this space, we will be your best, but not your only customer. So you can buy quick clot, as manufactured by Z-Medica, on Amazon for $30 a packet, as well as every soldier carrying it around. Now, whilst that's a big deal, 500 million closing plus various milestones, adding up to about 700 million, I think, Z-Medica loses the US Army contract in 2026. So there's a real drive for a new material to replace that quick clot. And you can see from these figures the size of that potential market. Very quickly, what were we going to do with the material next? Well, what we were planning to do was make it ourselves with a manufacturing partner, and then we were going to follow the Arista FDA approval process, which was various tox and stability studies with Charles River Labs. It takes about 6 months. These are standard paragenicity and antibacterial testing and so on. And then we'd already arranged a clinical trial with 4 hospitals in Alberta to use our material. And they were going to use it in emergency surgery, orthopedic surgery, and cardiac surgery over 200 patients against Arista and against gauze to see the benefits of our material. However, fortunately, when I got here and I suddenly realized I had the patent, which was very exciting, I'd taken it out of Toronto myself and I owned it, I suddenly realized that comes with great patents, comes great responsibility. I got a lot of bills for the patent. And maintenance of a granted patent is about a $5,000 a year process. So if I was going to hold on to this patent and let these stages go through, I was going to get some fairly big bills. Fortunately, I managed to find a company called Desicor, who are based in Kentucky in Louisville, who were very eager to license that patent. So just as a reminder, when I came out of Toronto, I came out with 4 patents. 3 around the bone glue tech, 1 around the hemostat. Those patents are, Toronto had a great process that we had an inventor owns policy. If I invented something, I could own it. And all I had to do, when that product started making money, was pay off what Toronto had invested in it. The sum investment from Toronto in Canadian dollars was about $200,000 in these 4 patents. Those bills only have to be paid up when the products are making money. But when I took the patents out, I suddenly started getting bills for the maintenance of those patents. So the easiest way to move forward was to get rid of one of those patents quite quickly. Desicor are a company whose business is in freeze-dried blood for military applications. They have a novel, clever way of freeze-drying blood. The technology came out of sea monkey technology. If anyone remembers sea monkey adverts in the back of comics and magazines in the 1970s? They're basically very simple crustacean systems that can rehydrate when you put water in them. They've used the same technology to make freeze-dried blood. But Desicor are smart. They don't know how well their freeze-dried blood works. So they have a huge amount of investment from the Department of Defense. We're talking hundreds of millions, not a conventional grant. And they've effectively are acting a bit like a hedge fund company now. They're putting most of their money into their freeze-dried blood, but they're also licensing other technologies in the blood space, so that if at the end of the day, 2 years' time, 5 years' time, 10 years' time, their freeze-dried blood doesn't work, they have alternative revenue streams. So Desicor licensed technology from me, exclusively licensed it in 2023. It was actually a year ago last week we signed the license. Earlier this year, they drove money into S&T to help develop the technology. Now, S&T don't have a stake in this, just so everyone understands. It's my patent licensed to the company. But Desicor are now putting money into S&T, so the UM system is benefiting. We developed a new way to produce this in a lower cost, faster way. Desicor last week signed 2 CRADAs. These are contracts with US government entities. One with the Combat Casualty Care Research Program to test this material in a range of traumatic situations. And another one which is close to being signed this week, with Travis Air Base to develop this material for military applications. Now, one thing they're doing, rightly or wrongly, is they're developing a COVID-style approach to getting this thing through the market. They're doing everything at once. They're doing the CRADAs to do the clinical trials at the same time they're submitting an FDA submission. And I also found out yesterday they're also doing the packaging of the material, so that when the material has been proven in the military environment and they have a regulatory application aligned at the same time, they can package it and sell it immediately. Desicor then, from this technology, they exclusively license it, they have upfront and stage payments to me, and when the product goes to market, I make a share of those profits. That's the market we're using. So that's really the story of the material. It's quite a nice happy ending, because if you'd asked me a year ago how this was going, I was sitting there with very large bills for maintaining this patent. Now I'm getting checks for licensing it, which is a nice place to be. So I'd like to finish off by saying thank you for your time and attention.
All right, I think we've got time for one or two questions. Could you clarify how the hemostat prevents tantalum particles from entering the bloodstream and potentially causing thrombosis in microvasculature?
Yeah, so we don't have any tantalum particles, we have tantalum ions. So anything that comes off this is an ionic species. We don't have any lumps of metal floating around. The glass starts to degrade, it releases certain ions that make up the glass. Those ions are released. They have innocuous reasons in most cases with the silica and the calcia. The tantalum ion just helps to speed up that clotting cascade, but we don't have tantalum particles, we have tantalum ions. Oh, sorry, yeah.
Okay, one more. Is the bioglass product safe to control hemorrhage associated with spinal injury that has exposed neural tissue?
There are, we haven't looked at the spinal applications. We originally looked at this I originally developed this for military applications in Canada, and when I was then told at the time Canada doesn't have any interest in military applications. What I found then when I was trying to find a way to get this funded was that Canada, compared to the US and the UK, has very high postpartum hemorrhage rates. And the reason that is that it's a big country with very few people in it. So you're transporting blood from one place to another, it takes longer, therefore you have a higher chance of bleeding out in the meantime. So we've only looked at it for postpartum hemorrhage, for military, and for topical wounds. I don't know anything about the spine, but it's something that hopefully Desicor will look at in the near future.
We've got more, but we've got some announcements to make.
So Dr. Towler, thank you so much for your work and for sharing it with us. As a token of appreciation, we want to share this. This was fabricated from lumber from the state of Missouri and represents your efforts to improve health across the state. And so just to wrap up, a couple small additional announcements. So again, please register for next month as we learn about gene therapies for cardiovascular disease. And also we have about 2 more weeks to this. So this is a postdoctoral researcher program. This is for late stage grad students, early stage postdocs. This can be across the whole University of Missouri system. This can be used as a PI to recruit people to the UM system or people that are currently in positions. Please apply. And then lastly, our first annual Pathway Symposium was last year. This year, this will be on March 13th and 14th in Kansas City. So we have abstract submissions opening in November. So please submit your work, and then we hope to see everybody in Kansas City. And thanks again, Dr. Towler, for sharing your work.
And travel support for anyone.
Yeah, there is travel support, and so if you have issues getting there, please let us know. We're here to try to solve that. We want to see people in Kansas City. Thank you.